Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. My name is Jon Peters. We are excited to present In Conversation, a video interview produced by Republic Gallery, filmed by Luke Pellizzari, and edited by Christopher O'Brien. In this interview, I sit down with the Vancouver photographer Jim Breukelman to discuss his practice spanning 45 years. We will also discuss his new body of work, Close at Hand and All Around, his beginnings as an artist, and his history within Vancouver's art community. Breukelman was born in Trinidad in 1941. He earned his Bachelor of Fine Arts at Rhode Island School of Design and studied under Henry Callahan in photography. Relocating to Vancouver in the late 60s, Breukelman is also the founder of the Fine Art Photography program at Emily Carr University of Art and Design, then the Vancouver School of Art. Breukelman's work has been widely collected and is represented by Republic Gallery. We hope you enjoy this video, and please contact us at info@republicgallery.com if you have any questions. So I want to start with just the name of the show. I thought that was a good place to start. And so you've decided to call it Close at Hand and All Around. Where did you derive that name from?
Because this work sort of first appeared in my peripheral vision, really, as I was driving to and from various projects. But not really able to look at what I was being affected by directly. Just noticing that there was a lot of energy on the sides of the roads, and then occasionally looking over and seeing little explosions of green and sinuous or very jagged lines, and it started to interest me, but still really just at a kind of a subliminal level. The reason I called it Close at Hand and All Around is because I was basically surrounded by it no matter where I went. Either here in BC or elsewhere. Like you'll notice that there's two images in the show that are also from Ontario. So these are not sort of deep forest pictures really. They're sort of more like the disturbed border between original forest and what we've done to that. So that's why it's called that.
And the decision to photograph them in black and white, and not only black and white, but multiple tones of black and white, how is that relevant to the work, or what does that do for the work in your opinion?
I noticed that, for one thing, I'm very interested in structure, having been trained as an industrial designer and also a graphic designer, but industrial design was where structure really came into play. The black and white I found really accentuates structure more than color does. I found for myself anyway, I get distracted from that when I'm looking at the color. Just you see the spaces between the lines much more clearly in black and white, for me anyway, than in color.
And you had mentioned that these forest areas, they sort of exist as peripheral or boundary areas, right, between deep forests and cultivated areas, I suppose.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of your work has to do with borders between things, right? I mean, I'm thinking back to maybe Mesocosm in a way, or even the paintball series where it's a border between an unnatural and a natural landscape.
Yes.
What is it about that border area that interests you?
I guess it's because that's where the struggle is being fought, really, between what existed and how we're altering it. And I think that's always been a theme in my work, pretty much. This work is probably the first one where I turned my camera directly towards the natural environment, and that is playing the main role. Even though like trees appear in my Mesocosm series and they appear in the paintball series too, they were kind of playing more of a support role to the overall idea. In this case, the main idea is the forest itself.
And I think that's a lot, sort of a large departure from some of your other works. You've kind of hit on it, that it's about the forest itself, where I think a lot of your other work, it seems to be more about how we modify our environments.
Yes.
But the common element in a lot of these works, both this one and some of your earlier works, is that they're all devoid of people, largely.
Yeah.
Is that a conscious choice for you, or is that something that just happens to be the way that it's photographed?
Well, I think it's sort of a bit of both. I kind of naturally gravitated towards scenes that were devoid of people, because I wanted to have a sense of expectancy, and these are like stage sets for things to happen in. I guess this is a bit of I'm diverging here a bit, but this series, it really reminds me of my youth when I was a young kid growing up in, or at least part of the time growing up in New York State, where we moved to from South America. And where we lived, even though it was just north of New York City in a place called White Plains, we were sort of halfway between White Plains and a place called Mamaroneck, which is on the coast. And that area was at that time not heavily populated. There were about 380 acres of woods directly behind my house, and no kids anywhere for about 3 miles. So I spent most of my time playing in the woods by myself, and sort of fantasizing about what might have gone on in those places, you know.
So are these works in a way that sort of return to that moment? Are they kind of imbued with a nostalgia for you?
They are, to some extent, yes.
Yeah, so, and then the other question I had, sort of separate to the content of the images, is just how you work in series very often. I mean, it's very often the case that rather than working as a tableau image, I mean, things are to be read together. Is that, again, a conscious decision for you?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What do you think that the series imparts that the singular image doesn't, or how do they play together?
Well, I think a single image can tell a story too, but it's easier to support a narrative and sort of get at people, get them thinking when they're presented with a series built around a theme, but hopefully not all too similar. That's
yeah. So what how is someone who is sort of unfamiliar with your work, how should they understand one piece and then the whole together? Does one piece tell a story in and of itself? You said that they're like stage sets in a way. Can they contain a narrative within one image, or is it the case that the entire series needs to be there in order to comport that narrative?
Oh, the entire series, but also whatever is imagined to possibly take place there is in the mind of the viewer. I mean, I probably have a very different idea of what might be happening in any one of these spaces than the viewer has. It's all really about conjecture, really, and setting the stage set for something to happen, or maybe it's already happened, and they're gone now in their history.
Speaking of history, speaking of personal history, I'd like to kind of return back to your time in New York and certainly at Rhode Island. And I know that your experience, as you mentioned, your experience as an industrial designer, your upbringing as an industrial designer, really informed certainly the aesthetic of this work in a way. I mean, the structures, you had mentioned structures. Can you talk a little bit about maybe how that background, first of all, and then how it sort of came to be, and then how it's contributed to this work?
I mean, how I ended up at Rhode Island?
Yeah, or just how from Rhode Island, you know, that education sort of, how that education has sort of, or what you got out of that education that you sort of bring into this work.
Well, when we moved to New York from Bogota, Colombia, I was born in Trinidad first, so then we moved to Bogota a few years after that. But coming up to United States, I don't know how to say this really. except that kids can be very, very cruel. So they always sort of focus on the outsider. So that was me. I was the outsider, and I had a fairly different accent coming from the West Indies and then South America, and so I ended up getting in a lot of fights, and so eventually it just got to be too much, and my parents thought, well, they better send me somewhere else. So they shipped me off to Canada to a school there in Ontario, which was on one hand kind of a gulag. and on the other hand, a very good education, and also I got to play a lot of sports that I never would have touched if I hadn't gone there. I'm probably the only Trinidadian that ever played hockey, for instance, maybe.
Likely, yeah.
But then as the time went on, like, it was a very strict place. And I managed to sort of get used to that, even though I had a number of strappings and canings. But I pretty well had enough by grade 12. And at that time, you were able to go. The only place in Canada you go to, I think, at that time, that you didn't have to have Latin was UBC. So I applied to UBC and got in and came out here to do a liberal arts. I chose liberal arts because I didn't have the faintest clue of what I wanted to do. I guess, for example, in grade 12, we all had to talk to a faculty advisor to sort of talk about what we had done in our grade 12 and before that, and what our performance was like and what we might think about doing in grade 13. Well, this fellow, I walked into his office, and there was this sort of pinch-faced little red-faced guy sitting in front of a clean desk except for the stack of papers in the middle, and he said, sit. I went and I sat down, and it was pretty tense, and he shuffled through the papers for a long time and looking up at me once in a while, and then he finally put them down and patted them all into a neat stack, and he said, Breukelman, he said, with your interests and your performance, you're actually, you should either have been born 100 years ago, or perhaps you should become a ballet dancer, because you're totally unsuited to the 20th century. And so I was floored. But anyway, I couldn't quite understand why that was, but anyway, I thought, well, thank you, and that's it. And so I left. And that really sort of welded it all together for me that I should move on. So anyway, so that's back to going to UBC. And I came out here, and I took, I can't remember all the courses I took. I remember trying to get music theory, because I liked playing trumpet. But I played by ear with trumpet. And I also took art history from B.C. Binning, and physical geography and Spanish from, I think, a woman named Senorita Davidson. And so on. I can't remember all the other courses, but the really humiliating one was when I went into my first music theory course, and the professor, he looked around the room and he picked on me and he says, "You," he said, "stand up and sing a Phrygian mode." And I was just, I was so mortified. And so I stood up and I said, "Well, I'm sorry, but I don't know what a mode is, let alone a Phrygian one." And so he said, "Out." See me in my office later. So when I went to meet with him, he says, "Look, if you don't know what a mode is," which is a scale, you don't belong in music theory. You should be doing that before you come here. So he said, I'm going to shift you into music history with Professor Pilz, I think was his name, which means mushroom in German, I believe. And he had a hairdo that kind of looked like a mushroom. But he was a really great guy. And so I had a lot of fun in that course. And I also had a lot of fun in the art history course because B.C. Binning was quite a character. Really knowledgeable, but a good sense of humor. And so at the end of the year, I more or less decided I was hopeless as an academic. And so I went back to New York for the summer. I was kind of worried because my whole family is, very academic. And I thought I would really get a blasting from my father. And but actually he was really nice. And he said, he says, when I was a young man, I had a hard time figuring out what I was going to do too. There's so many choices in life. So he said, tell you what, I have to commute into work every morning into Manhattan. He says, you come along with me and I'll go to my office. You go to the New York Public Library and go to the section on vocations and so on and see what you can find. He says, what sort of things were you interested in at all at UBC? And I said, well, about the only one really was art history. And not because of it being art history, just talking about art and actually coming to the realization that people actually could make a life as an artist. That never occurred to me before. So he says, well, fine, go see what you can find out. So I did. I spent about a few weeks in there anyway. And eventually I settled on industrial design only because I thought that might please him, being an engineer and a geologist and so on. So I applied to Rhode Island because they had a very good industrial design program there, and also to Syracuse University and Pratt and Philadelphia Museum School, and actually that's it because it was close by, and I ended up getting accepted into Rhode Island and started off in industrial design. So I had to go through a general first year program, which was everything, and then including all the different fields of art, and then into your specialization. And after a year in industrial design, I decided I hated it. I don't know whether you want me to go into the details of that.
If you'd like to, if you think it's important to the story, I mean, certainly, but it's up to you.
Well, no, it was just that I felt it was so constricting. The idea of, it was the same with graphic design too, where you're presented with a problem, and you gather all your information together and sift through it and gradually distill it down to what your approach is going to be towards solving that problem. I actually liked that part. But what I didn't like so much was after I'd finally decided what I was going to do, then you get into the long process of making it a reality. And that part seemed sort of dead for me, although I did like the end. At the end point when you finally got to
have something.
Yeah, I liked that, but that sort of period of just going through the motions wasn't much fun for me. And also industrial design was more sort of geared towards doing things for Detroit and stuff like that, doing hubcaps and or actually we did wallets too for all kinds of things that didn't really interest me very much. And I won't talk about the other thing I told you guys the other day because it's not for public consumption. Right. But anyway, the saving grace for me was, well, for one thing, you really learned a hell of a lot in industrial design to do with structures and how to put them together and how to plan them, and learned about materials and all sorts of things, including photography. And as luck would have it, Harry Callahan had just been hired to start the photography program at Rhode Island. And so that's how I got to meet him. I didn't have a clue as to who he was and how important he was in the field of photography. He just seemed like a nice person. And he liked my stuff, and I liked him, and I really discovered I loved photography. So he invited me to come into that program, and I did. So that's how I ended up in photography.
And one of the things that you sort of talked about just in that moment with industrial design, how you would work from an idea into a product, right? And you would sort of pre-phrase or preview sort of the arc of that project, and became very prescriptive, very narrow. You know, you were working towards a goal. And I know that a lot of artists, I mean, they work that way even through photography or sculpture or whatever medium. But that seems to be the opposite of your approach. Yours is far more inquisitive, exploratory.
Yeah.
So how do you reconcile that difference? I mean, from the beginning of your education to how you work now?
Well, I guess I was more interested, when I think back on it, on design, for instance, that idea of sort of having a notion of there is a problem to solve, and gathering the information. That's the part that really interested me. And so when I go out and work on my various projects now, I tend to have an idea that gets me out the door, and then I quickly abandon that. Once I get out there, I finally, sooner or later, I stumble on something that really interests me, that it's this beautiful, shiny object. And so I start photographing it, and then I start to narrow it down even more. You know, maybe I broaden out first, and then start to narrow down, and work into the subject, trying to discover things about it, and thinking about those discoveries that drives me further into it, and maybe off on different tangents. That's how I do it.
And so in industrial design, for example, you come to a point where you've achieved the product or whatever it is that you've intended to. With art, or with your art, is there ever that moment of closure? Is there ever that moment where the work is done? I mean, you've achieved, the project is over.
As I look on the wall, I can see so many things I could have done. And I will do.
Yeah.
But no, it's never finished. Yeah, and that's what's so great about it. And although I know if you look at the arc of what I've done, a lot of people think at least I think they do, that I'm quite all over the place. Each project is a leap from the other one, and some people don't see the connections, but to me there is a connection, and it's always, well, I don't know about this one, but generally speaking, I'm interested in how popular culture somehow leads people to have obsessions or deep interests that drive them to somehow alter their environment, or else create an environment that is kind of an homage to that interest or passion that they have. So the Biosphere was that, and the Afterlife series on the taxidermy series was that, and so on. They all have that. Also the Even Hot Properties, and the building of the fast ferries. They all have that basic thread that runs through all of them. they're acting like an agent of I don't know, erosion or building the way nature builds things.
It seems to me that, erosion, the term erosion, of course, I think has a connotation. Building has a different connotation. And I think that the tendency to sort of approach this phenomenon of people interacting with the environment, especially in photography. I mean, that's a trope, not a trope, but that's a theme that's existed in photography for a very long time.
Yeah.
And it tends to, in my opinion, kind of come with a value judgment. But yours doesn't seem to create a value judgment on that interaction. I mean, it's kind of agnostic in a way. You kind of are an observer, a neutral observer in a way.
Yeah, and I hope that that's a quality in a lot of my things, even though there is politics behind it, but I always try to keep it in the background. I tend to like my subject to speak for itself, and especially in these images of the forest, and also that's one of the reasons in all of these I've sort of zoomed in. I don't have trees or bushes sitting in open spaces in a nice little composition. There is composition in all of these. It's sort of hard to avoid. But when I compose these, I'm not composing right to left, top to bottom. I'm composing from directly in front of me out into the distance. I like to know what's going on beyond my subject always, but especially in these tree pictures. I don't know whether that answers.
It does. No, it certainly does. Yeah. And then, just if I can wear my interpreting hat for a moment. You had said earlier that that a lot of your work comes from this idea of pop culture and how people sort of take from pop culture and want to modify their environment or their influence to modify their environment. Did I catch that right? Did I interpret that correctly?
Yeah, there's and it doesn't necessarily have to be popular culture, but just happens that that's in some of my work, especially the Out of Fiction series, where I'm trying to think now. Well, let's maybe forget the Out of Fiction series. Think of the paintball series. That one was that came about. The whole idea of paintball came about a bunch of hunters that were out hunting deer, and they were coming back from the hunt and just chatting, and they were really feeling kind of bored. It wasn't exciting at all. And one of them had just come back from hunting Cape buffalo. And so he said, well, there's a hunt, because that animal really, it's smart, and it knows when it's being hunted, and it will turn the tables and be hunting you. And so that gives an extra bit of excitement to the whole thing. And then another fellow chimed in. He says, well, have you ever read The Most Dangerous Game? And that was a sort of a serialized story that was that appeared in a magazine that's no longer exists, called Collier's, back in the 40s and earlier. And it was basically about a guy who was a hunter and had other friends who were also hunters, and they chartered a boat to take them to South America to hunt jaguar. And one evening, while they were still cruising down through the Caribbean, through islands and so on, they got into this argument over whether the animal that was being hunted enjoyed the experience as much as the hunter does. And they could never come to an agreement. They got into a big fight in this story anyway. And the fellow that is the key person in the story is a doctor. He gets fed up, and he goes up on deck to sort of clear his head and have a smoke. And he goes to light his pipe, and it slips out of his hand, and it falls overboard, and he tries to reach over to get it, and he himself falls into the water. And lucky for him, he's close to this island that he thinks is probably uninhabited. Anyway, he goes on to the shore, and after he's recovered from that experience, he starts to explore to see what he can find. And he comes across this big mansion hidden in the jungle. And it's occupied by this mad Russian emigre who was I guess a famous Russian general, but also a famous hunter. And so anyway, he finds this out when he knocks on the door and gets let in. And he's shown great hospitality. He's given a place to clean up and a change of clothes, and served a fabulous meal. And the hunter starts talking to him, and they recognize that both of them have a reputation of being good hunters. And he says, okay, now I have a proposition for you. It's not really a proposition. This is going to happen whether you want it to or not. I'm going to give you a knife, and I'm going to have a gun, and I'm going to hunt you. And if you can survive 3 days, then you will be let free. Otherwise, well, it's just over for you. And that's basically the story. And there's more to it, but anyway, these guys said, well, that would be really interesting, hunting somebody. But of course you can't do that. That's against the law, and it would be immoral. So what they decided instead was instead of hunting with bullets, they would hunt with paintball guns that were used for marking trees back in those days, and also marking cattle. And so they did that, and they got very excited by the game, and people heard about it, and gradually it grew. And it grew from that group of 5 guys to virtually thousands of people doing it now. But when I read that story, I was quite amazed, and I had a look at one of these paintball things, which actually I was directed to by Diane Evans, from Emily Carr and the Polygon now. Anyway, I went and had a look, and I was just astonished at the space. It was so fantastic, and it had been altered so much by an idea that came out of popular culture. And when you walk into that space, everything from about 15 or 17 feet above ground is like a pointillist painting. And the ground is devoid of any kind of grass or anything. It's just this red dirt. And then every so often you'll see a place where there's been a little tiny fortress type thing or cover that's been constructed for people to hide behind. And there's all these splats, of course, on that, and all these expended and unexpended paintballs. They're sort of pearlescent, really beautiful. And then above that 15-foot level, though, you have an absolutely normal-looking forest. The only thing that's not normal about it is there don't seem to be any birds. There don't seem to be any insects anywhere.
They've learned.
So, but there are all kinds of spaces like that, you know. And that sort of has been kind of, in a way, kind of a quest at the back of my mind, because I really don't, as I'm serious, I really don't like to have a hard, fast project in mind before I get going. But I know now that that's an interesting subject. If I stumble across it, I'm thrilled, you know, to find something that's I guess basically the result of cultural fallout of some sort.
Mm-hmm. But I see in these works a similar tendency to sort of talk about or think about modifying landscape. I mean, whether it's overt, you know, modifying paintball is as clear an example as you can get, right? I mean, you talk about there's no birds, there's artifice, there's this pointillistic sort of thing. But here, I mean, you've spoken about these structures that start to appear, and it seems to me that the modification of the landscape occurs in the mind.
Yeah.
And it's this going into this space, and if popular culture as our shared history, I think you're drawing from a very personal one. And is that at all evident to you in your work, or am I kind of off to left field, kind of reading too much into it?
That I'm drawing from a personal.
Yeah, that you've drawn from a personal experience, and that,
Yes.
that there is a thread in this work and all others that you've done.
Yeah.
And certainly in terms of the idea of boundary, of modification, that those things do exist in this work.
Yes, it does. You're right. Because it does take me back in time to those times when I was wandering in the woods and playing out fantasies. And if I had friends there, that was even better still. BB gun fights and stuff.
Comes full circle. Yes. This is the genesis of the paintball series.
God, I never thought of it.
Well, that's what I'm here for, Jim.
I remember in one of those fights, I hit him in a particularly vulnerable spot, and he was infuriated. And I remember like those Daisy BB guns, they were really hard to cock. To move the lever. Honestly, he was like the. I can't remember the name of that series, but anyway, a guy that had one of those cocking Winchesters. He was just going like a machine. I was being pelted all over by BBs. Anyway, I'm sorry.
That's okay. No, it's a good anecdote. I would ask then, is there anything about either this work or your practice that we haven't had an opportunity to touch on that you think is really important in understanding this work or understanding your practice generally? Well,
I don't know whether you can see this in the work or not, but it's definitely an idea I always have about photography. That I think a lot of people, at least I've heard people say that comparing photography, say, to film, still photography to film, that it's less, I can't think of the word, less dynamic or something. But that's not the word, but anyway, that'll do for now. But I see it differently because I think it's quite an exciting, fluid medium. And one of the things that has always fascinated me about it is that there really is a direct, in my mind anyway, there's a very direct physical connection between what's on the final print that you're holding in your hand and the actual object or person or whatever scene that was photographed originally. And it doesn't matter whether it's been done 2 minutes ago or a century ago. It's still there because when the photograph is formed on the film, it's formed by light physically bouncing off the subject and coming back through the lens and landing on the film and being recorded there, and then it's sitting there latent, and then you develop that, and then you put it in the enlarger, and then you print that with lights passing through something that's been directly connected by light to the subject, and it ends up on the paper. So you're not that far away from touching the original scene. That's the way I feel about it. To me, that's the real magic of photography. And also, the other thing that I like about it is, and I'm always thinking about these things when I'm doing the pictures, that it's kind of like looking through a microscope at objects that you wouldn't normally be able to see. Photographing a slice of out of all time is similar. You've isolated it so it can't move, so that you can now study it, and when you look at it, you can float into it and discover things that you never would have discovered physically with your eyes when you're looking at it, because there's just too many things to take in. But I love that sort of quality of photography, the precision and detail of it, the malleability of it. to deal with different aesthetics and different subject matter. So I don't know whether that's...
That answers it perfectly. I think that gets us there. I think. Sure. Yeah. Okay. How are we for time on the? Yeah, we probably do. Do you want to talk about? We'll jump to something totally different. Your process of coming to Vancouver
started and then I completely dived.
No, that's okay. So
so we pick up again.
Yeah, we'll jump back. Maybe just insofar as Emily Carr. I mean, how Emily Carr came to be. Your involvement with the photography department there, and sort of its foundation. I think that's a really interesting story.
Yeah. Well, just quickly, if we go back to leaving or graduating from Rhode Island School of Design, I didn't know what I was going to do, but I thought, well, I'm going to give myself a better chance at breaking into something by going back up to Canada, to Toronto, because I knew people there from my previous school, and plus it was just before Expo 67 was going to open up, and I thought, oh, there'll be all kinds of jobs for people like me, but it was a mistake because all the work had already been done, and now all those people, there were just literally hordes of them going from place to place looking for work, and so that I joined the hordes. And it was a total disaster because, for one thing, interviews, I would go and think I should be all dressed up in a suit, and then would be confronted by people with puka shells and bell bottoms and flowered shirts, and so then I definitely wasn't going to be accepted in there. Then I went to other places all dressed up, and it would be just the reverse, I would be in the bell bottoms and they'd be in the suits. It was so horrible. And then finally, but they just didn't have work anyway. But I went to a place called the Royal Canadian Institute of Architecture, run by a woman named Anita Ahrens, who was an Australian. And she said, well, we don't have anything for you here, but if you are interested, we need somebody to photograph the new SFU campus and also the aquarium. And so I said, yes, I'll do it, because there wasn't anything else for me. So hopped in the Volkswagen, and me and my wife roared out to the West Coast. And in the meantime, my parents had also moved there because my father had finally retired, and my mother was from British Columbia. So anyway, arrived here, did the jobs, and then it was the same thing all over again, no work. And so one day I decided, well, I'd go to the art school here and see if they could point me in any direction where I might find work. It never occurred to me that the school would be it. But anyway, I talked to them, and they looked at my work, and they said, well, we're thinking of starting a program in fine art photography. Would you be interested in doing that? And I said, oh God, thanks, but no thanks, because I've just barely gotten out of school myself, and I don't know what it is to be a teacher, and I was the type that likes to hide in the back of the class. I just can't see myself doing that. I wish I could. And so they said, okay, well, good luck anyway. So I went out home, and I thought, well, I think maybe I should go back to Rhode Island and start over, go from there. So I went back there, and I went to visit Callahan, and when he heard that I'd been offered that job, he said, you're crazy. I've got grad students who would give anything to have that job. So you're not going to leave this place till you phone them and see if that job is still available. So I did, and it was. So I had to come all the way back out here. and then they sent me to a guy named Dr. McGann, who was, at that time, it was Vancouver School of Art, and it was under the Vancouver school board system. And so this guy said, what are you here for? And I told him I was here for the job in photography at Emily Carr, or not Emily Carr, at Vancouver School of Art. And he said, $350 a month, take it or leave it. That was my little negotiation. So I took it. I didn't know what the counter would be to that. And so I signed all the papers and everything, and then I was to show up, I can't remember, it was not right away, but in a couple of weeks. And I went there and found that they had built dark rooms, but they hadn't put in, they were enlargers, but no lenses, no negative carriers, no chemistry, no trays, nothing, and the class was going to be showing up the next week, and this was a Monday. So lucky for me, my parents were there, and I'd stored all my stuff at their place, and I said, would you mind if I set up a darkroom in the basement? And they said, sure, go ahead. And so I did, and I didn't want to move my stuff to the school. And so anyway, the class was small. There were only 7 people the first year. And so I drove them to my parents' place, and Bill Cupid, who was one of the first students, he helped drive them over, and I think somebody else had a car. And so I taught them how to develop film and work with cameras and so on. And we had our classes out in Lighthouse Park, and also in the little room in the basement too. And my mother cooked meals for them, and it was kind of fun. And then eventually the school had smartened up and got all the other stuff, and we were able to move back to the school. But we were there for a few weeks at my parents' place. So that's how I ended up there. And the photography area was in the basement of the secretarial school. And that was no problem for a long time until we started getting into color photography, and we were teaching them how to print color. And color is just unforgiving. You've got a plus or minus half a degree, or it's ruined. And so we found out that we had to watch out for the coffee breaks, because when the students upstairs in the secretarial school would go for their coffee breaks and the washroom breaks, the water the temperature of the water would just go wild. So we had to work around that until the school was generous enough to give us temperature controls, stuff like that. And then eventually it just grew and grew, and we became independent. We finally had enough of being under the school board, and we so fought to be independent, and the government moved us to Granville Island, and the deal was that we had to change the name to Emily Carr College of Art and Design. And that's how that all started. And it became from 7 students to more like 150 students.